Well, we are now on part 14 of my respectful rebuttal of Richard Gage's 9/11 video, Blueprint for Truth. I have offered up 171 reasons for natural collapse so far, and I will add several more in this section as we talk about the number and the size of the fires and the symmetrical destruction of Building 7. Gage asserts that Building 7 fires were not severe enough to cause a fast global collapse. He reminds us that no plane hit Building 7, that no major structural damage was caused by the debris from the crash of the Twin Towers, and that no tall steel frame structure had ever collapsed due to fire before. Richard and his fellow controlled demolition advocates tend to minimize the fire damage by quoting the NIST report itself, which reports fires they can actually observe as open flames in photos and videos, even though the fires inside the structure may not have been visible. In addition, they often quote NIST's draft report of the fires, even though the final report shows pictures of more fires on more than 10 floors, like they had in the draft report. Richard also contrasts videos and photos of huge fires in steel-framed buildings with the NYPD picture of the north face of Building 7, on the side where the fires were the least severe. I am concerned that those other images aren't shown because the 9/11 presenters want to minimize the damage that actually happened. Richard also stated that, quote, NIST never acknowledged the evidence of implosion as quoted by FEMA, close quote. Well, FEMA used the term implosion and NIST used the term collapse, and the collapse that they describe is indeed one of a building falling inward upon itself. This is yet another way to try to prove that NIST is dishonest, but it's worth mentioning that NIST's initial hypothesis included diesel tank fires setting off the collapse, structural damage from the tower collapses, and eventually NIST rejected both of these hypotheses in their final report. And even David Chandler has said that NIST made more of a correction than they had to after they got public feedback on their draft report, recalibrating the building's collapse measurements to show freefall for 2.25 seconds. Which side of the Burning 7 building gets shown? NIST showed all sides. 9/11 truth videos tend to show just the north face. World Trade Center 7 likely had points of origin on 10 floors. Water supply to fight the fires in World Trade 7 was impaired, and in World Trade Center 7, for several hours, no efforts were made to fight the fires. In fact, the fires over 7 hours were so extensive, I can't imagine why anyone would set up a controlled demolition in a building that would have had to be dismantled had it stood anyway. Chris Boyle, an eyewitness, saw damage to Building 7 late in the morning and said, quote, it was a huge hole right in the middle of it. Here's a picture of first responders walking over cool debris while Building 7 fire is raging behind them. And where are those rivers of molten debris? Now let's watch how much debris hit Building 7 and the damage that it caused. While the BBC was mistakenly reporting the predicted collapse of Building 7 as a fait accompli, I was watching ABC correctly reporting the prediction of an imminent possible collapse. They had this live video which I saw that day, and I was glued to the television. As you can see from these videos, fires raged on many but not all floors. Smoke is actively pouring straight from many floors. NIST acknowledged that smoke banked up on the south face due to wind direction, and they were extra conservative, reporting fires mostly on floors where flames were actually visible through the windows. However, these videos do show smoke actively pouring out of the building, not just hanging around the outside. The very top floors don't show much fire, which is consistent with NIST's claim that collapsing columns on the lower floors caused the collapse of the east penthouse on top. In a March 6, 2011 debate, Richard also said these pictures show smoke but no fire. When the fires first started on the southwest corner of Building 7, people were running for their lives and the dust was blocking their view anyway. NIST reported that many fires burned themselves out in the 20 to 40 minutes and then moved on. The fires left behind not only burned out areas but structurally weakened areas as the beams and columns expanded, sagged, contracted, and weakened. Then the fire started moving to the interior of the building. Is Richard Gage suggesting that all the smoke wasn't evidence of fire, or that burned out areas went back to full structural strength? Richard Gage tries to minimize the size of the fires. Then he tries to maximize any evidence he can find of extreme heat in a debris pile. For example, Richard Gage showed this crushed hunk of metal with rust on it, supposedly showing previously molten iron, since aluminum doesn't rust. He talked about temperatures in the 3,000 plus degree range that must have created this molten iron meteorite in the collapse. Well, is this true? Let's take a closer look, literally. Zoom in a bit down there and you'll see scraps of paper embedded in the meteorite. You can't even read some of the text. I imagine paper withstanding extreme crushing forces is possible, but does it burn at Fahrenheit 451? A minute ago, I asserted that there was no water to fight the fires in Building 7, a NIST claim that is backed up by several eyewitness firefighters. 9/11 Truth researchers try to cast doubt on this assertion with this picture of firefighters using a hose shortly after 1:30 p.m. See, they say plenty of water to fight the fires in Building 7. But a 9/11 FDNY first responder told me that, quote, they had what appears to be one hand line. There would never have had enough pressure to get the hose to the 7th floor or above in the 7th building. Too much hose would have had to be stretched into an unstable structure, further endangering firefighters' lives unnecessarily, close quote. This hose, by the way, wasn't even pointing at Building 7, and Fire Chief Nigro is known to have ordered all firefighters out of the way more than 3 hours before its collapse. An FDNY firefighter told me personally that, quote, there were no city water lines that fed the hydrants in the area, just a limited amount of what they could get from a relay, where water is suctioned out of the river and relayed from pumper to pumper and fed to different nozzles. Putting out car fires to allow safe passage of rescue workers and hosing down the collapse area to facilitate finding any survivors were more important. A vacant building that would have been virtually impossible to extinguish anyway was not high on our list. It would be virtually impossible to get water up 7 stories. You would lose too much pressure by the time it got there, close quote. Clearly, for several hours, the firefighters were unable to effectively douse the flames of this 47-story building. 9/11 controlled demolition researchers often find discrepancies within the NIST report or differences of opinion between NIST and other experts on the details of the collapses. For example, the fires in Building 7 are explained in the NIST report with photos and simulations. NIST said the fires on floors 11 to 13 persisted in any given location for approximately 20 to 30 minutes, close quote. 9/11 researcher Chris Sarnes says, according to NIST, quote, the fire was burning under the beams in the girder between 2:30 and 3 p.m. The fire was burning in the area of the collapse along the north face at about 3:05 p.m. Here is a photo of actual fire pouring out of the 12th floor. By 3:10, it had spread to the northeast corner. That means it had burned out in the areas of the collapse by around 3:40 p.m. This photo shows the fire had burned out in the east half of floor 12 by about 3:50 p.m. The NIST simulation is clearly fraudulent, close quote. Here's another photo taken around 4 p.m. that shows the fire had burned out on floor 12 in the east end, close quote. Chris Sarnes also says that NIST issued its final report in 2008, and it's called a final report because their investigation is now over. In a personal conversation with Michael Newman at NIST, he said that it could be reopened if major new information came along that changed their conclusions. Has Chris Sarnes found evidence of NIST fraud? Dave Thomas, a mathematician and physicist, disagrees and told me personally that, quote, all that Chris has actually found are scientists considering multiple working hypotheses while trying to solve a difficult, complex problem. Look at the photos along with the fire simulations. In this third picture, there is smoke coming out of the 12th floor, so perhaps the fires were inside the north wall at the time, but no longer on the edge. And in general agreement, this is like the NIST simulations. On page 48 of the NIST report and the PDF report, they explain, quote, while use was made of the appearance of flames and window breakage in photographs and videos in formulating the simulations, the investigation team realized that the timing of the simulations might not align exactly with the timing of the fires on September 11, 2001, close quote. In my mind, the most important question is, was it demolition or not? Questions like, did NIST get it perfect? Did Shyam Sundar at NIST explain everything perfectly when he was reviewing the draft report? These are much less important to me. The Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat has expressed some disagreement with aspects of the NIST report, including the issue of thermal contraction we talked about before. Its director, Dave Scott, was confronted with 9/11 Truth advocates who accused him of conflict of interest and the NIST report of being a fairy tale, using the technical critiques of CTBUH to support their attacks on NIST. David Scott replied directly, the Council would like to make it clear that it sees no credibility whatsoever in the 9/11 Truth movement, and we believe, with the vast majority of tall building professionals, that all the failures at the World Trade Center were a direct or indirect result of the planes that were flown into the two towers. We have carefully looked at the evidence that the 9/11 Truth movement presents, and we cannot see any credible scientific evidence of a controlled demolition on World Trade Center 7 or any of the other World Trade Center buildings. The Council considers that the truth movement is a distraction and should not obfuscate the performance issues which should be at the center of this debate about how best to continue to improve and develop fire and life safety in tall buildings. We believe that the failure was caused by thermal expansion, but perhaps the critical point of time was as the expanded beam returns back to its original position. This is part of the thermal expansion theory. David Scott continued, the NIST report is written by engineers and is about technical issues that can and should be discussed on a technical basis. The videos on the 9/11 Truth and AE 9/11 Truth's websites are not technical. There is no blatant evidence in support of controlled demolition. As chairman of CTBUH, I am well connected to most of the leading practitioners of tall building design. The Council represents organizations with well more than 100,000 employees. I do not know anyone of an organization or in the Council that supports the controlled demolition theory. The ASCE has an engineering membership of 120,000, and they participated in the production of the NIST report. Against this, you have the AE 9/11 Truth movement, which has support from approximately 80 licensed structural or civil engineers who have signed this petition. Now, in proportion to the industry, the level of support that the 9/11 Truth movement has is tiny. However, I understand why 80 people did, because the response from government was slow, and the one-side videos of the 9/11 Truth movement that they show are very compelling if you do not review them critically. Scientists recently told me, quote, already thermally expanded beams do not have to collapse right within the process of expansion. It can occur sometime afterward. My grandfather had a barn that caught on fire, and the day after I went there to help out. It had been put out during the night, so the frames and half the boards were still there. During dinner, 12 to 13 hours after the fire had burned out, we heard a crashing sound and jetted outside. The barn had collapsed completely. I think the evidence is strong that the unfought fires in Building 7 over almost 7 hours were very large, and that the fire collapses can happen even after fires have left a specific area. But when Building 7 came down, it came down pretty straight, and it went into, quote, a path of greatest resistance, as Richard Gage asserts. We'll talk about that in the next section. Thanks for watching.